Are we live?
Yes, sir.
Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. This is my apologies. It's going to be a little odd because I don't get any feedback in hearing you. But if anybody wants to put anything into the chat, let us know where you're dialing in from today, or zooming in from today, or LinkedIn living in from today. Let us know. We'd love to see it. And we're going to wait just another 15 to 20 seconds, and then we're going to go ahead and get started. So let me kick it off today. I want to make just a brief comment, a safe harbor statement. So we're here today. We're going to talk about forming a company, some things to think about when you're forming a company, some of the tax implications. But this is not legal advice. We are not forming a client-attorney relationship with Michele today. He's just here to give his thoughts as if he was a friend of yours. You called him up and said, "Hey, I'm starting a company, but I need to get a contract for me and my clients. Can you help me out?" And that's kind of the context that we're going to talk about this stuff. So while we're doing this, we're going to drop that QR code up on the slide there. If you take a picture of that, you'll go to the Slido for this, and we're going to also drop the Slido in the chat if we can, the link. And if you have any questions, put them in Slido, and let's have people upvote them or downvote them, so we can get some interaction and get all your questions answered today. I think we're going to be done with the presentation certainly with under an hour, but we booked an hour and a half because last time I did this, we got lots and lots of questions. And when you're starting a new venture, you're going to have lots of questions. You know, you're creating a company. What kind of company should you create? What should its structure be? What are the tax implications of that? So I want to give you a framework to think about that. When you think about company structure, an LLC is a company structure. An LLP is a company structure. A C-Corp or a corporation is a business structure or company structure. When you talk about things like S-Corp, that's not a corporate structure, that's a tax classification. When you talk about QSBS, that's a tax classification. So you're going to create a company. For many of us, it'll probably be an LLC, a single member or multi-member LLC. Probably for today's purposes, I doubt if anyone's going to create an LLP, but you'll see LLPs, limited liability partnerships. You'll often see those with medical practices, dental practices, attorney firms, organizations like that often will create an LLP. And it just stands for limited liability partnership, as LLC stands for limited liability company. LLCs are quick, easy ways. But why do you want to do this? Well, when you're creating a business structure, it's a separate entity from you. And what does that mean? That means that the business is responsible for its own profit and loss and debts. You're not. So it separates you from that entity, which makes it a little bit more difficult for somebody to come after you for the business's debts. So we hope your business does not go bankrupt, but if it does, it's a little bit more difficult. Of course, there's limitations to this. If you go out and rent commercial space, those contracts are going to make you sign personally, and you will be personally liable. But it's still important to think about creating a company, an LLC or a corporation, to get that separation of that entity. Okay, it's kind of like creating a trust for your personal assets. Similar. So when we're talking about LLCs and LLPs or corporations, we're talking about business structures. When we're talking about S-Corp or QSBS, we're talking about a tax structure. Now, an LLC can choose to be taxed like an S-Corp. There's just an additional form we'll talk about today that you fill out. There are some reasons to do that. If you're a single member LLC, you don't need to do that. What would happen is you'll be taxed just as an individual. So if the company makes $100,000 this year, that's going to flow right to your 1040 form and filled out by you or your tax advisor on your own 1040, much like you would do every year when you got a W-2. So That's a little bit how to think about it. Michele, do you have any thoughts on business structures or anything that you'd want to add?
Mate, I have a lot of thoughts. I'm looking forward to diving into some of this stuff as we get to it in the presentation. I think maybe at the outset it might be just sort of helpful for me to introduce myself. My name is Michele Leonelli. I'm an attorney. I work primarily with small businesses, startups, investors, and entrepreneurs, and I handle all of their legal needs. So everything from entity formation and corporate governance, all the way through to raising money, M&A, and then all of the commercial and corporate contracts that companies need, MSAs, partnership agreements, NDAs, employment agreements, and things like that. So my practice focuses on sort of the full spectrum of business legal needs. And yeah, mate, I'm really looking forward to jumping in here. I have a lot of things to say, but I think it's best if I hold off until we get to them.
Okay. Well, thank you for very gracefully covering up my screw up, since my first thing was supposed to introduce you. I appreciate that. You're very kind. You could have had a lot more fun with me.
No worries, mate.
So Michele is actually a graduate from Georgetown Law School. He's a brilliant guy. He's wonderful to work with. And so if you're thinking about him for any of those things, he's someone to contact. He's based in Austin, Texas. He's licensed in the state of California. And he's very experienced in corporate law for small, medium, and large businesses. So I think for the majority of my audience today, most people are probably going to want to form an LLC, either single member or multi-member if you've got a partner. If you're creating a software company, you might want to create a multi-member LLC, but then choose to be taxed as an S-Corp. What does that mean? As I said earlier, an S-Corp is just a tax classification. That's all it is. And it just treated differently and a little more formally. If you want to be taxed as an S-Corp, you're supposed to form a board. You can have up to 100 shareholders, no more. They all have to be U.S. citizens. And so any of these things is just, you're opening up if you go read the rules, it will give you a headache and put you to sleep. But the Internal Revenue Service tax code is very laborious. You will want to have a tax advisor. I'd recommend a CPA as you look at these different things and what kind of organization you're going to create and what kind of tax status you may want to choose. Creating the corporation itself is very, very easy. I literally 2 days ago went and created Executive Focus as a Florida corporation. And we'll talk a little bit about that. And it took me 15 minutes probably, the whole process, and cost $125 in the state of Florida. And I'm still kind of weighing if I just want to be taxed as an individual LLC and have it flow right to my 1040, or if I want to do it as an S-Corp. One of my other companies, I co-founded a company called Novus RX in 2010. It's a software company, builds an e-prescribing system for physicians. I choose to have tax status as an S-Corp. And that means at the end of the year, all the partners got K-1s, which is another document that you have to file with your tax advisor. And it can, these things can get complex depending on your personal tax situation. My return now is up to about 65 or 70 pages, which I think is ridiculous and is getting kind of expensive. But these tax considerations will start to change that. The other tax structure that is mentioned here that I'm listed is called QSBS. That just stands for Qualified Small Business Structure. That's kind of a new one. Well, it's not new. I think it came out in 1992, but a lot of people hadn't heard of it. If you're going to have your company for more than 5 years, and it's never going to have more than $50 million in assets, there are some fantastic tax advantages if you ever sold it, if you're structured as a QSBS, a Qualified Small Business Structure. You cannot do that with an LLC. You have to be a C-Corp, a straight C-Corp if you want to select QSBS. And it's section 1202 of the Internal Revenue Code. It's very, very complex. You'll need at least a CPA and probably a tax attorney to figure out all the implications. And if you qualify, there's a lot of very, very specific things that hoops you have to jump through to make sure that you qualify. And it's an ongoing basis. and you'd have to have the organization for at a minimum of 5 years. So there's both time periods associated with this and other rules. And a C Corp, the reason that most people, small businesses in particular, would not want to select being structured as a C Corp is because there's going to be a double taxation. The corporation pays taxes at the corporate tax level, and then the owners would get their essentially equivalent of a K-1 or some kind of distribution, and they would be paying taxes on that. And so it creates a level of double taxation and complexity that most small companies would want to avoid if at all possible.
John,
there may be a time where it makes perfect sense.
Hey, sorry, mate. I want to jump in here. I think you've given us an amazing sort of overview of all of the these considerations. Maybe if we jump to the next slide, I think that might be a helpful sort of reframing of the discussion, because I think really what you've outlined really well for everybody today is that we have sort of two considerations. We have the structure that an entity should take if you are looking to form an entity, and we can look at sort of why an entity is appropriate to begin with, and then sort of what entity you want to take, what entity you want to form. And then I think the next consideration, as you've outlined here really well, is sort of what are the tax implications of that structure, and why you might choose one or the other. And I think it might be helpful to sort of dig in first and foremost into the first two topics. First of all, why form an entity at all? What's the advantage of even doing that? Why would you get off the couch to pay the money and do, wade through the administrative hassle of forming a separate legal entity? And then which one of those two should you choose? And John, if you don't mind, I'll jump in here because you asked me for my thoughts, and I think this might be somewhere I can add a teeny little bit of insight. So generally speaking, the reason to form a legal entity is exactly what John mentioned earlier. And that's because the legal entity creates a separate entity from you personally. And that entity is therefore sort of a shield for any personal liability that you might have otherwise faced in going out and conducting business in the world. So, for instance, creating an LLC means that if something happens to that LLC and it gets sued, and you lose the lawsuit and the person suing you wins, that person can't, except for a few really limited exceptions, can't come after your personal assets. They can't go after your retirement accounts. They can't come after your family home, etc. So the benefit of a separate legal entity is precisely that it's separate from you and it shields you from liability. I think when we're looking at which of the entity formation or which of the types we want to go with, we sort of got a couple or a number of them that really, end up being the ones that people choose from. And John's done a great job of outlining those. And they are really going to be single member LLC, or just an LLC in general. And we can talk about the distinctions between single member and multi-member in a second. An LLP, a limited liability partnership, or a corporation. It's important to sort of note here that a sole proprietorship isn't a legal entity. It's not really a separate entity. It doesn't fall under that same rubric. So a sole proprietorship is when you, the individual, just go out into the world and start doing business. If I go out on the street and start selling hot dogs and do anything else, I don't set up any legal entity within which to do that. Me, Michele, the hot dog seller, I'm a sole proprietor. What that means is that if I sell someone a dodgy hot dog and they get sick and they sue me, my house is potentially on the line to cover the costs, the debts of that lawsuit. So if you're going to go out and sell dodgy hot dogs, it's probably a good idea to pick one of these other legal entity types so that your personal assets aren't on the line in the event of a mistake like that. So now we come to sort of the other entities that we've looked at, and we've got LLCs, we've got LLPs, and we've got corporations. And I think the format of choice for most folks is going to be, and it has been in my practice, an LLC. The reasons for that really are that they're fairly easy to set up, and they're easy to sort of understand and administer. An LLP suffers from a couple of problems that the LLC and the corporation don't, and it's all around this protection with liability. Generally speaking, partners can be liable and are presumptively liable for the bad acts of their co-partners. So that sort of creates sort of an additional category of liability or risk for the partners that go into a partnership. Whereas with an LLC, it's very easy to sort of delineate that liability as between the members of the LLC. The other reason an LLC is preferable to a partnership is that it's easier generally to sell interests in that LLC. It's more of an asset than the partnership is. It exists more as a separate entity that you can sell interest into and bring other members into, whereas a partnership, it's harder to do that. And then we have the corporation. Corporations are great. They provide some additional flexibility with respect to equity, how you sell equity, how you use equity as an incentive for employment, options, stock options, things like that. Much easier to do in a corporation. The downside to a corporation is that there are additional layers of governance that are required for a corporation. So setting one of those up and then managing it on an ongoing basis can be a little bit more challenging and can require a little bit more outside help, like from an attorney. But in terms of liability protection, it's the same as an LLC. It's a separate entity, and so it should do the trick. John, have I said anything that's sparked anything for you so far here?
No, I think you gave an excellent cover. The sole proprietorship, I generally do think is a bad idea. You always want to work with your advisors and your attorney, your CPA, but it's your business. And a sole proprietorship does not have that separation, and somebody, could come after you. Now, I've been in business with 5 different LLCs over the past 20 years, and I've never ever been sued, and none of my companies have ever been sued. But that doesn't mean it can't happen. And so I think taking some of those precautions is just smart business nowadays. We unfortunately live in a very litigious society. So much like as your assets grow, you're going to want to probably put some things into a trust. If you're going to create a company, create a separate entity. There's no reason not to. It's very simple. It's very, very cost effective.
Yeah.
Let me spend a minute on where you might want to incorporate. I think it generally makes a lot of sense to incorporate in your home state. I take it all back. All of my corporations have been in the state of Florida when I lived in Florida. California is pretty expensive. If I still lived in California, I would think seriously about creating a company outside of California, maybe in Nevada, maybe in Arizona. Again, that has tax implications as well. In fact, Arizona is a pretty easy place to create a company. It's pretty inexpensive. It's around $100, but there's no requirement for an annual fee and or an annual report. What do I mean by that? Here in the state of Florida, every year, it cost me $125 to create an LLC. And then every year I have to file an annual report. It's 2 pages long. It takes 5 seconds. Well, it takes about 5 minutes to do. It's very, very short. But it's an income stream for the state. They charge me $138.75 every year for an annual report. And so I have several LLCs and I have to do it for each one of them. If not, you'll be essentially out of the agreement with the state and they will make your corporation inactive. And that can have other consequences that are not good. In the state of Florida, for example, if you're late, they charge a monster fee, about $470 to then get reinstated. However, there's a loophole in the state of Florida that I found out about because one year I did forget to do it on time, and all of a sudden, if I did it, I was going to get this additional fee of $475 that is non-negotiable, according to them. I called up the State Department of Division of Corporations. I talked to a couple people. They were very nice, very helpful. And they said, you don't have to do that. Just wait till in the state of Florida, September 30th. That's the date that they are all going to roll them all to inactive. And they said, make this request around this date, and it's only going to cost you about $129. And so which is pretty close to the regular fee. So check with your state. Sometimes there's a way to work around some of this stuff. Sometimes there's not, but it's worth looking into.
Yeah, I think the where to set up your business is an important one for a lot of folks. And I think it's important to make a tiny distinction here. The term incorporation only applies when you're setting up a corporation. So it doesn't apply to setting up an LLC. People use those two fungibly. It's very common, but it's sort of important to recognize that for what most folks will do with setting up an LLC, that's just going to be setting up their LLC in a given state. And there are advantages to doing it in one state or another. There's a number of states that people typically choose from. That would be their home state. California is a common one because a lot of folks do business in California, Delaware, and then you hear that Nevada and Wyoming are two as well that people like to use. There's different reasons to use one over the other, but I think the simplest answer is that setting it up in your home state is probably the way to go. And if you're truly going to be an LLC that does things all over the country, then Delaware is also a good option. The reason for picking Delaware is that, and this reason is why a lot of corporations incorporate in Delaware as well. It's that Delaware has the most well-developed body of business or corporate law. And so if there's a dispute, you typically want your dispute to be heard in Delaware because it's going to be heard by the courts of chancery in Delaware, and it's going to be heard by a judge that has a business background. So rather than going to a jury and being heard by a lay judge in another state who may have no idea about the nuances of the business situation you're in Delaware, your disputes will be heard by somebody who knows what they're doing. So that gives companies a lot of sort of comfort. Now, for what a lot of folks, for the scale of what I imagine a lot of people on this call are looking at to do with their business, they're probably not even thinking about something like that. They're not likely to get into litigation, and they're not likely to have a business that's going to take on a global or a national footprint. So if you're just starting your consulting business or your fix and flip business, you're starting a small company to do, I don't know, maybe it's renovations or whatever. I would say probably set that up in your home state. One thing I hear a lot is people like to set things up in their LLC up in Wyoming, because in Wyoming there's this sort of cloak of secrecy around what people can discover publicly in terms of the membership of LLCs, and I suppose that's attractive to some folks. I don't know if it's worth setting up in Wyoming for that reason. It doesn't mean you can't be sued. It just means that if someone Googles you and goes onto the Wyoming Secretary of State's website, they won't see your name listed there. If you're doing something that you truly want to be secretive, maybe that's worth setting it up in another state. But one thing to keep in mind is that if you're doing things by the book, you will need to take that LLC that was set up in Wyoming and then form or file it or register it as a foreign entity in your home state as well, which will mean sort of paying double the amount of formation fees and reporting fees every year that John was talking about. So for that reason, I typically encourage people to set it up first in their own state.
So those are excellent points. Let's dive deep into that for just a second. One of the things that during the process of creating your LLC, you will have to appoint or name a registered agent. When I did my very first one, I'm anybody who knows me will tell you that I'm relatively identity theft paranoid. So I'm very concerned about public information being out there. I'm very concerned about people shopping to see who are the owners of the corporation. Can I sue them? We just live in kind of a crazy time. And so Wyoming sounded kind of interesting to me, but I didn't do that. What I did do, though, was I had a friend of mine become the registered agent. The main purpose of a registered agent is they will accept service of process. So if you do get sued, guess what? The registered agent is the person that gets the paperwork that's going to get followed around by a process server and say, sir, you have been served. And it's just a legal way to start that process of somebody bringing suit to you. Again, it's never happened to me. I doubt if it'll ever happen to you, but wanted you to understand that. So I was and since then, I no longer have my friend be my registered agent. I'm the registered agent of all three of my LLCs, and it hasn't been a problem. I still worry about it, but it hasn't been a problem.
The other thing with being a registered agent is that you have to be somebody who checks the mail every day. If you're likely, or liable to take off for a 6-week trip, or go stay with your in-laws for a few months or do something like that, might not be a good move to be your own registered agent, because essentially being a registered agent means that you're a reliable post office box that can be found and checked every day.
And that's a good point, because there are companies that will do this for you for a fee. There are also companies, obviously, that will create your LLC and or your corporation if you want to incorporate. I don't think it's necessary. I think if you've got a good advisor or two, you can do this stuff yourself. The paperwork literally took me 15 minutes the other day, and I just put it on my credit card.
Yeah, that's a good point, John. I think, let me jump in there because this is something that comes across my desk quite a lot. I think it's quite easy to set up the entity, at least an LLC. Corporation's a bit trickier. I mean, maybe for what you were doing in Florida, not so. But if you're going to set up a corporation in Delaware, and you're looking to build a corporation because you want, to bring on additional investors and things like that, there's quite a bit that goes into that. But even with setting up an LLC, so we talked about a single member or multi-member LLC. So the single member LLC is just essentially when there's just one owner of that business, and that's probably you, the person setting it up. Multi-member LLC is when you're bringing in other partners or other investors or co-founders of that LLC, and there needs to be some sort of divvying up of the rights and responsibilities and equity and revenue from that business. So in the event of a single member LLC, that's a fairly straightforward thing to set up. Administratively, they're not hard to do. Now, the LLC has one governing document, and it's the operating agreement. In the case of a single member LLC, that operating agreement usually isn't super complex. In the case of a multi-member LLC, that operating agreement typically needs to be drafted with some care and attention because it's taking into consideration, all the rights. It's like a contract as between all of the partners of a business, right? Now, some folks will set up a single member LLC and won't bother getting an operating agreement in place, or they'll have someone like Rocket Lawyer do it. I definitely don't recommend doing that. The precedent that you're going to find and the templates that you get from a place like a Rocket Lawyer or someone like that, one of these online companies, they're horrible and they come across my desk a lot and I end up throwing them away and starting again. So not worth the money generally. Now, I also get the question, well, then what's the point of having an operating agreement if I'm a single member, if it's just me in the business? Who cares, right? Yes, to a certain extent, but the whole point of setting up the LLC, if you're a sole proprietor, if you're a single member of that LLC, is again to create that liability shield, right? It's to create that separate legal entity for you. Now, that legal entity can crumble in the face of a lawsuit if you don't observe certain formalities and if you don't treat the LLC as a separate legal entity from yourself. And there's different ways in which that can occur, right? So one classic way is if you don't have a separate bank account for that entity. If you just have your personal bank account and the company's bank account all intermixed, and someone sues the LLC, it becomes quite easy for that claimant to establish that LLC actually wasn't a separate entity. It was really just an extension of you personally, and therefore all of your assets should have to go to covering the debts of the lawsuit. So another way that distinction between you and the LLC can crumble is if you don't observe another formality, which is having an operating agreement in place. Having a well-drafted operating agreement says to the court and says to the other person, hey, I was treating this thing as its own separate entity. Look, it's got its own governing documents, it has its own bank account. And so for that reason, I encourage my sole member LLC clients to also have an operating agreement. And it doesn't have to cost a whole lot of money to draft. If you come to someone like me, it can be done quite easily. But it's worth having done. It's worth having done properly because also a lot of times those LLCs go on to take on other members over time. Oh, your buddy wants to get involved in the business. You find somebody who's really important to you. You want to bring him into the business. Well, then you need to have something that's drafted to account for now different interests, different ownership structures, different revenue shares, different equity shares, and so those need to be drafted, I think, properly by an attorney.
That's an excellent point, and let me just echo that. If you have a multi-member LLC, I think it's very important to have that operating agreement and literally have documented in it your divorce proceedings. What do I mean by that? This happens all the time where there's a falling out of some type, and it can destroy the company. But if ahead of time you've worked with someone like Michele and said, okay, let's say that we decide we don't like each other anymore. You might want to do what's called a buy-sell agreement. So either I buy you out or you buy me out at 1 times revenue, or whatever makes sense for that business. It's very important to think through these things if you're getting into business with somebody, because it's not just you. So much like a marriage, if you're going to get together with somebody else and form a company, you should think through your divorce proceedings, have them documented very specifically in the operating agreement that you've worked with a qualified attorney on. It makes the whole process so much easier. And because all of a sudden, all the arguing's gone, you've already decided it. Literally, I've seen people say, listen, do I buy you out? Do you buy me out? We're going to flip a coin. Just so all this stuff is documented and so it's clean.
Yeah.
Especially important in a multi-member LLC. I want this to be very interactive, and it's weird that I can't just bring people off mute. So I'm going to go ahead and take a couple of the questions that have come up in the chat. There's one, I'm not sure what somebody means by this, if they want to specify it, but they're asking, will this be recorded? Somebody's answered that. Yes, it will. And it will be available. And if you want a copy of the slides, they're going to be available. Emma, don't let me forget to mention that at the end, but it's just, if you go to executivefocus.io, it's a landing page. You put in your email address, you'll be able to download the slides. There's a question from a LinkedIn user that says, what kind of company do you have now? I've got a real estate company that I formed about a little over 20 years ago that owns some rental properties. I've got a software company called Novus RX, and I just formed Executive Focus literally 2 days ago, although I've been working on this for about the last 5 months. There's another question. I was told a registered agent must be in office that is open during business hours, Monday to Friday, 9 to 5. That is not correct in the state of Florida, and I don't believe it's correct anywhere. Michele, what do you think?
No, I mean, when you form an LLC or a corporation, you just have to list the registered agent on there. There isn't any requirement that they be or not be anything. Usually, I mean, I can't speak for all 50 states, I guess, but in my experience, in the ones I've worked in, you just have to put someone down that basically you have to fill in the registered agent on your organizational documents when you file with the state. That just needs to be a person at a location, that's sort of reliable. The function of the registered agent is that they are somebody who receives official correspondence and communications on behalf of the business. So in practice, it'll help if they're open from 9 to 5. It'll help if they check the mail regularly. It'll help if they're diligent, don't go away on long holidays. But these aren't requirements by law. These are just, the point of the registered agent is that they're there as sort of your flag in the ground to receive all of this official correspondence from the state or from people who might want to, sue you or whatever. The point of that then means that you probably want to have someone who's reliable and is around, but there isn't any legal requirement usually that they be open in any specific hours.
So some other things you need to keep in mind. If you were to choose to be taxed as a S-Corp in your LLC or multi-member LLC, that's a more formal process. You need to have a board. Means you're going to have board meetings. When you have board meetings, guess what? You've got to have minutes, and it's very important to document that stuff. LLCs, you can have board meetings. You don't have to. You don't have to have a board. It's a more relaxed, just an easier structure to operate in for most businesses, especially if you're starting a side gig or if you're starting a consulting firm. It's very easy to do. The consulting firm, you may want to continue, depending on what you and your tax advisor decide, you may want to have it taxed as a sub S. That's a discussion you can have. But if it's being taxed as a sub S, it means it is going to be a little bit more formal, and you have to do some more things. But there are some potential benefits as well.
Do you think it's worth diving in, John, into sort of what the benefits of a corporation versus an LLC? Because I think we've both sort of danced around the fact that for most folks the LLC is going to be the fit because it's a bit easier to get into, it's a bit easier to run, less governing documents, sort of quicker. But corporations exist for a reason, and maybe I can give sort of a quick primer on why folks go the corporate route.
Kick it off. That'd be great.
Okay. So in my experience, I see folks opting to form a corporation, or I will counsel them to form a corporation when one of two things is on their horizon. When they're either looking to raise money, outside money, not from just friends and family, but usually institutional money, venture capitalists, VC money, things like that. Those entities are always going to, or almost always going to basically require that you be a corporation. The reason for that is that it's easier to sell and easier to transfer equity in that business than it is in an LLC, and that's for tax reasons largely. The other thing to keep in mind for forming a corporation, or why you might want to prospectively form one, is if you're looking to use equity in the business as a form of compensation. So stock options, restricted stock, things like that. Despite the fact that a corporation is a little bit more complex in terms of its governing documents and its setup, it's actually a lot easier to give away equity to your key employees and to offer it as incentives than it is in an LLC. Sort of a bit backwards, but giving vesting equity in an LLC for tax reasons, largely because they're taxed as partnerships, is actually a bit of a nightmare, and it can require bringing in sort of like the cavalry with respect to tax attorneys. And those guys make my fees look like the dollar menu at McDonald's.
Well said. There was another question that says, if you are a single member LLC/S Corp, you still need a board. If you're going to be taxed as an S Corp, technically you should. Nobody's going to come chasing you if you don't, or looking at you if you don't. And you'd need to, Michele, I can't think of any big legal repercussions if you choose to be taxed as a sub S and you didn't form an official board. I know most companies don't actually, that I know of, but I can't think of any legal ramifications.
Yeah, I actually rarely see it. I think I actually have I have an LLC that is taxed as an S Corp, that they're elected for S Corp taxation status, and I don't have a board. I mean, it's just me, but yeah, no, I'd say it's pretty uncommon. I think typically where you have a board in a situation like that is where it serves sort of a function within the business. You're bringing in outside advisors, or you want to give certain key stakeholders in the company a say in the governance of the company. But otherwise, I don't actually really ever see it happening at the LLC level. What can happen within an LLC with respect to a board is, so we've talked about LLCs being multi-member or single member, and that's all around how many owners of the business there are. But there's also another distinction that you see with LLCs, and that's whether they're going to be member managed or manager managed. And this isn't so much about the ownership of the business, but around the governance and who's running the show. So a member managed LLC is one where the members, the owners of the business, are sort of the people who also run the business. And that's probably more common for what I imagine the folks on the other end of this presentation are going to do. A manager managed LLC is where you have owners, but then the management of the company is delegated to someone or to a group of someone to run. And that can be to some subset of the owners, or it can be pulling in some outside expert, right? Like you could have 5 people with a bunch of money, and they've identified one person who's an industry expert. That industry expert is going to come in and get paid a salary to run the business. The members are going to remain the owners of the company. And in this case, you'd have a manager managed LLC, because this manager has been delegated the authority to run the business because that's their expertise, let's say. So in that instance, you have sort of a board. You can have sort of a board-like structure. You can delegate the authority to running the business to a board or a set of managers. And so that might be a way to achieve the same thing.
So there's a couple of questions around this in the chat that I want to address, and 1 or 2 in Slido. Sham asks, can you take an S election on an LLC later if you don't want the complexity now, but S status after your LLC grows to a certain size and revenues later? I believe you can, but it's on the IRS website. It actually states that you should do it soon after formation. So let me give you an example. The company that I formed the other night, Executive Focus, the one that you're seeing on the screen, then I went to the IRS and I applied for an EIN number, which you have to do, an employee identification number, or I'm sorry, an employer identification number. And that's to file taxes and so that the IRS can track you, essentially. They say that you can do it later, but they said soon later. And so that, to me, that kind of means 0 to 90 days. I'm sure you can do it after that. I just don't know what the implications are. Michele, do you know?
No, I don't. I'm pretty. I'd say fairly basic on the tax side. So I know enough to be dangerous, but I don't know enough to give any tax advice. I was under the assumption that you could make an S election later on, but I don't know.
You might be able to. I know you can for at least up to that, probably certainly 90 days. Much beyond that, I'm not sure. You want to ask your tax advisor. But it kind of leads into something else. Elon had a question in Slido that he'd sent me ahead of time, that he was getting advice to let me go look at his question again. Other than legal separation, would you explain taxation differences between sole proprietor and LLC? Was told it helps reduce taxes by a lot. And then a follow-on question, what do you know about incorporating Massachusetts? I understand it's very expensive. What are the pros and cons to incorporate in a different state? Let's talk about both those. So the first one, I think I don't really understand the advice that you got, Elon, and I would question it about the sole proprietorship versus LLC, depending on which way they're saying. But There is the legal separation is the most important aspect of it, in my opinion. There's no difference that I know of in taxation. So a sole proprietor would just be going to your 1040, and an LLC would be going to your 1040, unless you've created a sub S, and then it's going to be a little bit different.
There may be a difference, though. If you set up an LLC, you're able to you're able to take advantage of a number of business write-offs that you can't, I think, as a sole proprietor. So that might be the distinction. But yeah, I mean, typically an LLC is going to be a pass-through tax entity, so it's not the IRS doesn't treat it as a distinction from you personally, the owner. Whatever the revenue is, or of that business, is going to be passed directly through to you, the owner. But the difference is that having a business, you can write off a whole lot of business expenses that you wouldn't be able to do as a sole proprietor.
Just let's scroll down on that. What ones wouldn't? So I don't really see that difference as much as you do. And as a sole proprietor, I could have a spreadsheet with my revenues on the top and all my business expenses underneath it, and then my net income, and that should still be what goes to my 1040. What specifics am I missing?
Maybe none. I've not operated as a sole proprietor, so
okay.
Yeah, you're the expert in this category. I
you use that term loosely, expert.
No, not at all, mate. I would think that for certain things, like for instance, an SBA loan, that's a small business association loan. You can't get that as a sole prop. You'll have to be, a separate entity. I think also. Well, yeah, let me leave it there. I think that's one instance I know of where having a separate entity is worthwhile. I don't know how banks and lenders treat, businesses versus, you personally. There might be sort of better credit terms and better credit facilities if you have an entity, especially if you have more than one person in that entity, employees with company credit cards and things like that. You can start to take advantage of sort of some leverage there. But yeah, like John mentioned earlier, until that LLC has a bit of a track record, most lenders are going to require that you personally guarantee whatever the LLC does. And so, as between you and a bank, let's say, they're going to come after you, even if that liability shield won't really help you, when it comes to paying your debts to a lender.
So a brief shout out to Sham in the audience, has also talked to a couple of different people, and in the information is that he or she believes is that pretty much the same, whether it's a sole proprietorship or sorry, it's moving so fast I can't read it. I talked to a couple of tax people, and I don't think there's a difference between LLC and sole proprietorship for tax. Neither do I. So we are in agreement there. He or she also comments, but there is for an S-Corp. Oh yeah, big time, because of distributions that can be made versus all the profit being counted as employee income. Well, you can do that with either an S-Corp or an LLC. You can pay yourself a salary, or you could take distributions. You have that flexibility whether it's an LLC or an S-Corp. But it's still an interesting point.
I think the distinction there, though, John, is that if it's an S-Corp, as an S-Corp, you have to pay yourself what's known as a reasonable salary for whatever the thing is that you're engaging in. So if you're a lawyer, you have to pay yourself what would be a reasonable salary in your field. And so some percentage of what the S-Corp makes needs to be given to you as a salary, but then some percentage is allowed to be paid as a dividend, and that dividend gets treated differently in terms of taxation than the salary would. So the salary is taxed as income, whereas the dividend isn't, right?
Yeah, that's a good point.
So there's quite a bit of a tax savings there. I think, for instance, the dividend doesn't pay self-employment taxes, FICA, FUTA, and the Social Security and Medicare taxes. So there's a tax reduction in the amount of dollars that come out of that bucket.
Jumping back to another question up a little bit, we covered a lot on liability side, legal separation. Can you speak to the taxation aspects of LLC versus S-Corp? Was told that an S-Corp will save a lot of money in taxes versus sole proprietor. It could versus sole proprietor, but the taxation between an LLC and or an LLC structured as an S-Corp is going to be pretty much the same, I believe. I am not a CPA, so please talk to your CPA. But the advice that Elon had gotten was that there was a big difference between a big savings between sole proprietorship and LLC, and that still doesn't make any sense to me. It's from a taxation standpoint, depending on the way you pay yourself and stuff, but and that would impact taxation. And I don't, that would be easier to do an LLC than a sole proprietorship, because a sole proprietorship is just all going to flow to you. Where if it was a multi-member LLC, you might be paying different people, things of that nature. But other than that, I don't see a big tax advantage. I see no advantage to being a sole proprietorship. I think it's more risky, and I see no advantage to it whatsoever. Again, talk with your tax advisor. And if you find different, please come back and tell me. I'd love to hear it.
And Anne had a question. This might have been covered, but does an LLC for, say, a consulting business have to be set up in the state you live and operate out of, or can you take a more advantageous state for setup? And this is a good question, and this touches on something that comes up a lot of my practice. The technical answer, like the by the book answer, is that you should set it up in your home state. But the reality is that I've never really seen anybody penalized for setting it up in a different state. I would say, the advantages as between one state or another are usually just around sort of reporting fees and filing fees. So if you find a state that's more advantageous, that might be a good fit. I think the threat is, or the only risk here that people need to sort of manage, and again, I've not seen this come to fruition, but that, the by the book answer would tell you to look out for, is that if you don't set it up in the state that you're in, like the state where you generate revenue, you need to set up, that LLC needs to be set up either as an entity or is it registered as a foreign entity. And so if you live in that state and you're running this consulting business, but you have it registered in another state, well, eventually that income is going to flow back to you in that state. And so the theory goes that the state will recognize that and realize that and then tax you on that, because they'll want their cut of you being in that state generating revenue. That's the by the book answer. I haven't seen anyone get busted for that, but I think if you got big enough and you had enough of a footprint in your home state and weren't registered as a foreign entity, or you didn't have the LLC set up in your home state, then you might sort of trip their alarm bells and then they might realize what you're doing. I don't think the end result would be catastrophic. They'd just fine you. That's my guess, but I haven't actually ever seen it come to fruition.
I'll tell you one that I mentioned earlier. If I still lived in California, I'd be very tempted to set it up in another state. I will tell you the one caveat to that, a very serious one. The California Franchise Tax Board is very aggressive. And if you live there, even if you're running a business elsewhere, I would not be surprised if they're going to come after you for their share of your income via state income tax. California is very, very aggressive about that. They have been for a long, long time. So speak to your advisors. The other thing, Elon is in Massachusetts, and he mentioned, what do you know about Massachusetts Corporation? I went and looked it up. It's very expensive. It's, I think it's $500. I've got this on the next slide that we're going to take a look at it. Well, we'll look at it right now, as a matter of fact. I think it's $500 to create your company, and they hit you $500 every year. That's a pretty steep tax, in my opinion. So I thought that was kind of interesting.
Yeah, I think it still is 500 filing and 500 annual fee.
Where is?
I think Massachusetts still is.
Yeah, it's. Let me see if I can pull it up. Michele, is it showing the right screen?
Yeah, it's just not showing as a
presentation.
As a slideshow.
Okay, let me see if it
looks like we've got someone in Massachusetts chiming in here. Yeah. And what states were you thinking about, Anne? If you're able to type in, I'm curious to know what ones you're pondering to set up your LLC. So we have a bit more feedback. It's $520 to file, and it's the same for the renewal every year. It sounds like in Massachusetts, yeah, it's pretty steep. There are certainly some cheaper options than that around.
And if anybody else wants to throw in a state, well, I certainly don't know them all by any stretch of anybody's imagination, but we can certainly comment on those that we know. Some of them make it really arduous, and it can be, $500 every year. To me, that's a very stiff tax on your business.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it sounds like I would love if whoever's out there and wants to chime in and let us know what business entities you currently have or you're considering setting up? Like what are you trying to do? So we have Anna, I think, who's said that she's got a consulting company, which is cool. I'd love to know what the others are. I come across a lot of my clients are consulting companies, either as side gigs that they're setting up on on the side of their regular job, or they're going into business with some friends. They've got some expertise, and it's a cool footprint. It's obviously it's easy to get into. It's if you're an expert in something, it's a great way to leverage that. It'd be cool to hear some other input from some folks. Oh yeah, $800 in California. Yeah. And I know it's crazy. Delaware's a good one. There aren't going to be, the difference between setting it up in Delaware and another state really at the end of the day is going to come down to fees and reporting requirements. Arizona is a good one. It's $50 to set up, or it can be $85 if you want it expedited. This is the LLC. And I don't think there are any ongoing fees from there. So that's a good one. Delaware is great because, again, you have that very robust body of corporate and business law that if you ever get into a dispute in, it's going to be where you want to have your dispute heard. But if you're just setting up sort of a side hustle to do some consulting or whatever, unlikely that you face any legal repercussions there. But Delaware is also a good neutral state for a lot of like choice of law provisions in contracts. So if you're a consulting company and your clients are in every other state in the country, Delaware is sometimes a good middle ground for where you put your choice of law in your services agreement. So if you're set up in Delaware, you can take advantage of that too. John, I'm just going to keep running with some of these questions if that's cool with you, mate.
Please.
If you register in a different state, do you still need to do something in your own state? Yeah, good question. So this is still part of the same discussion around where you need to be set up. Again, the theoretical answer is that you need to set up, you need to register. It's called, so let me back up a second. When you set up your LLC, you set it up, you pick a state to set it up in, right? That LLC is then a creature of that state. Where if you want to take it to another state, which is what we're talking about now with registering it in a different state, you do what's known as registering it as a foreign entity, which is basically like going to this new state, the secondary or tertiary state, and saying, hey, I'm going to be doing business in your state. I'm just letting you know I'm going to pay the fee as if I was set up here. Now, you don't duplicate the entity itself. You just register it in that state. And so to your question about whether you need to do something in your own state if you've set it up elsewhere, it's sort of like what Anne was asking. In theory, you should. In theory, if you live in your state and you're running a consulting business in a bunch of other states, you're still doing business in your state because you live there and that's where the revenue flows to. So in theory, you should set it up as a foreign entity in your state if you filed it to begin with in a different state. The inverse would be true. If you set it up in your home state because that's where you live, and then all of a sudden you have a bunch of clients in a different state, you should probably, in theory, register it as a foreign entity there. I don't tell a lot of my clients to do that in practice because it just means more fees and more headaches. And I've never seen anybody get busted or get in trouble for doing it. So this is where theory and reality sort of like don't really mesh up. But I guess it really comes down to a determination of how big your footprint and how much sort of noise you're making in a given state around revenue. And let's say you go and rent space in a state and you have employees in a state. I would say, yeah, you want to file as a foreign entity in that state, or you want to form your LLC to begin with in that state. But if you're just, let's say a software company or consultant and you have clients spread out all over the country, I wouldn't go I wouldn't go registering your LLC in a different state in that case. I think just picking your home state is probably the move.
So I'm hoping you can see my screen. Restream was giving me a little bit of heartburn, but in almost every state, if you just do a Google search for Massachusetts Division of Corporations, that's going to be where you want to go. But here's a perfect example. In Massachusetts, this is the fees, and it's 6 pages long. But if you get down here to, there's partnerships, there's foreign, limited liability companies, certificate of registration, $500, annual report, $500, name reservation, $30. It goes on and on and on. And so some states, this is a tremendous revenue source for them. So they like that. Florida's a little bit more reasonable. Samson Holdings, this is my real estate company. So you can see I formed this company in 2003. And every year I've got an annual report. There's not much to the annual report. It doesn't really say anything, but you are required to go out and do it. And so every year I do. and voila, that's kind of what it looks like.
John, let me ask you a question about your real estate company. Do you form a different LLC each time for each of your rental properties, or are they all under one?
No, I would recommend, and I'd love to hear your comment on. I would do a separate LLC for every single property.
Yeah, that's the correct answer. What makes you come to that conclusion?
Separation of liability is the biggest thing, because let's say you have a slip and fall. I want it to be isolated to that property and not be able to get to all my properties or other properties.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's spot on, mate. And I counsel my clients to do the same. I have a lot of clients who are, who have a real estate sort of holdings or fix and flips, or, even just side hustles. And the pushback I sometimes get, and I would love your input on this, is, oh, but then I have to have separate bank accounts for them all. And oh gosh, what a nightmare. Have you found sort of a banking resource that allows them to make that really easy and streamlined?
No, but right now I only, I have 6 units at one property address, so it's very easy for me. Mm-hmm. I've got a buddy of mine who's got 200 units, and I hadn't thought about that, because that one I would want to. So if you're in that kind of a situation, you'd want to look into how you might be able to create some kind of master account and sub accounts, because if you're doing things like, let's say you have 200 units, you're probably going to have a staff of 10, and you've got to make payroll. And making payroll out of really small accounts can be really tedious. There's some outsourcing solutions that would work for that, but yeah, you don't want to create any extended liability for yourself and or create internal nightmares in your own processing and paperwork. So that's something to think about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it's also worth noting for some of these entities, the type of business you run will impact sort of how much of a footprint you have in a given state. So again, a consulting company, or like a SaaS based business, or an e-commerce platform or something like that, don't really probably need to set up a company, register as a foreign entity everywhere else that you have clients. But if you're going to have a physical presence, if you're going to have brick and mortar somewhere, then you probably want to think about having registered as a foreign entity.
So, are there any other questions? Please, if so, please put them in the chat. We'd love to hit them, because we're kind of winding down the presentation piece. There's a couple articles that I've got in the presentation that go deeper on LLC versus S-Corp, a lot more detail on what QSBS is. If you download the presentation, you'll have that information. Again, you can download the presentation at executivefocus.io. It's just a landing page right now. The rest of the site's not up. In fact, we got this, my web guy got this up at 3 a.m. this morning. God bless him. And also, if you have any problems with that, because I tested it and it's working, but you can always just send me a text or connect with me on LinkedIn, and I can send it to you that way too. So if there are any other questions, let's type them in. If not, we're going to start to wind down. Oh, hold on a sec. Sham has another one. The savings on the S status, if you're over the Social Security contribution act, which probably be the case, most of us, it's only 160,000. Then your only savings is something like 2.9% savings, which is probably only worthwhile when your revenues get pretty big. I'm not sure if I understand that, but that's an interesting statement. Because somebody had sent me a text on a different topic saying that they wanted to put a bunch of money into their 401k because the limits had increased, and that definitely talk to your CPA or tax advisor. Already it was set up. Yeah, Shim, I'm not sure exactly. It's an interesting point, but I don't have a specific answer about the contribution max. With that, are there any other questions? Listen, as an aside, we're going to be doing more topics in the future. If there's anything else that you guys would like to have a session on, please let me know. I'm going to do some Ask Me Anythings, and I'm going to pick some other topics around sales, marketing, biz dev, hiring, leadership. So if there's other things that you guys would like to know, please let me know. Also, let me know what you liked about this and what you didn't like. I apologize for my screw ups at the beginning. This is my first time with Restream and simulcasting to LinkedIn and YouTube and a few other places. And all of a sudden, when I can only see my presentation, I can't see what else is going on. So my apologies for some of the hiccups, but I appreciate everyone's time. Sham's got one other comment. I can't scroll down. There it is. Let me make a comment on two other important comments. One is on payroll taxes. If you have employees, be very, very careful about payroll taxes. Those are not bankruptable. They're very serious. A lot of small businesses get into trouble by not paying the right payroll taxes. That's an excellent point. In fact, if you ever acquire a company, even if you are smart and only acquire the assets of the company when you buy the company, which you should do, you should not buy the whole company and get their liabilities. Payroll tax problems in the past, those come with it no matter what, even if you only do an asset purchase. So that's an important one. And then another one about banks. As soon as you go and create a bank account for your company, the bank's going to love you and they're going to say, "Oh, we want you to have a business credit card." Everybody has different beliefs on this. My belief is don't do that. Go get another personal credit card and use that for your business expenses solely, because you do want to keep that separation, but you have more protection on a personal credit card than you do on a business credit card. You have little to no protection on a business credit card. That's why the bank is so eager to give it to you. The fees are higher, the interest rates are higher. The Credit Card Act of 2009 passed some protections, and there's been several others that give personal credit cards and you as an individual a lot more protection. You'll still get the points, you'll still get everything else on the purchases you make for the business. You can still track it separately, but I do not recommend that you get a business credit card. I do recommend you have a business account and probably a business checking account at least, possibly a savings. Something to know about your checks. Those are critical. You need to protect those. You either keep them in a locked file cabinet or a locked safe. If somebody gets a hold of your checks and writes checks, which employees have done, I've got friends that have lost tens of thousands of dollars. Bank is not going to give you that money back. It's a business account. You're responsible. So be very careful with your banking checkbook. It's very, very serious. You don't have anywhere near the protections you have with your personal checking account. So the banks are, they're not so friendly about some of that stuff. That's something to keep in mind. With that, I want to thank everybody for taking the time today and coming to hear this presentation. I really appreciate it. Give me some feedback on through LinkedIn, email, any other way. And I appreciate everyone's time today. And I hope you have a great Thursday. And we look forward to putting another one together and talking to you soon. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, John.